It happened in less than 48 hours. More than 200 containers of U.S. cheese, worth nearly $3 billion, were turned away at the Canadian border. No warning. No negotiation. Not even a polite Canadian "sorry." Just a flat-out rejection backed by a crushing 300% tariff. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. Canadian shelves stayed stocked, but Walmart in the U.S. was overflowing with near-expired cheese. American dairy farmers were forced to dump milk by the gallon into the dirt. And in the middle of this chaos, Canada was quietly signing billion-dollar dairy trade deals with other countries. The U.S. dairy industry wasn't just losing money, it was losing credibility on the world stage. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on the bell notification so you never miss an update on stories the mainstream media won't fully tell you. The shock at the border. It started like any other week for the dairy transporters hauling their cargo north. Trucks filled with U.S. cheese, butter, milk powder, and cream were lined up at border checkpoints from Detroit to Vancouver. But instead of the usual quick inspections, Canadian customs officers began unloading and checking everything. Drivers reported that inspectors were unusually strict, taking extra time to examine the documentation, product origins, and even expiration dates. By the end of the day, it became clear, this wasn't a routine check. The shipments weren't going through. Every single container was marked for rejection, citing new trade rules that, according to Canadian officials, had taken effect overnight. U.S. exporters were blindsided. Many of them had no idea that Canada had moved to enforce its maximum tariff rate on certain dairy imports, a staggering 300%. For American dairy companies, this was more than just a bad day. Each rejected shipment represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost sales, plus storage fees, trucking costs, and the looming nightmare of figuring out what to do with perishable products that couldn't be resold quickly enough. Dairy plants scrambled, farmers panicked, and the ripple effect began to spread across the entire supply chain. Why Canada slammed the door? To understand why Canada did this, you have to understand its supply management system for dairy. Unlike the US, Canada tightly controls how much milk is produced, how it's priced, and who can sell it. The goal is to keep Canadian dairy farmers profitable by preventing oversupply that drives prices down. For years, US dairy companies have been trying to sell more milk and cheese into the Canadian market, especially through loopholes in trade agreements like USMCA. These loopholes allowed American companies to ship certain products, like milk protein concentrates or cheese blends, into Canada without triggering the highest tariffs. But Canadian dairy farmers have been complaining that these loopholes hurt them, driving down prices and undercutting their sales. So when Canada decided to close those loopholes and enforce the full tariff rates, it wasn't just about money, it was about protecting its own farmers from what they saw as a flood of cheap American dairy. The US response: panic and politics. Back in Washington, the reaction was immediate. Senators from dairy-producing states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California demanded action. Industry groups accused Canada of violating the spirit of USMCA, even if technically it was within its rights. At the same time, American consumers were starting to notice something strange. Grocery stores, especially big chains like Walmart, were suddenly flooded with discount cheese and butter. Some products were only days away from expiration because they were never meant to sit in U.S. warehouses. The surplus was so massive that even food banks couldn't take it all before it spoiled. Milk dumping crisis. As rejected cheese piled up, U.S. dairy farmers had no choice but to start dumping milk by the gallon. In rural America, dairy farms were built on delicate financial balances. If one shipment is lost, it can spiral into massive losses. Milk that couldn't be sold quickly enough ended up in ditches, fed to crops, or processed into low-value products just to avoid total waste. Farmers described the situation as heartbreaking. Generations of work, late nights, and careful herd management were being erased almost overnight. Social media filled with images of streams of fresh milk being poured into fields, tractors hauling away unsellable cheese, and local markets struggling to adjust. It wasn't just farmers feeling the pain. Trucking companies, refrigerated storage facilities, and even rural diners that used local dairy products were thrown into chaos. The economic domino effect was immediate, and experts warned that this could impact rural economies for years, not just weeks. Canada strikes gold. Meanwhile, Canada wasn't just protecting its borders, it was cashing in. While rejecting U.S. shipments, Canadian companies were quietly finalizing billion-dollar dairy deals with countries like New Zealand, the EU, and parts of Asia. These deals allowed Canadian cheese, milk powder, and butter to flow into markets willing to pay premium prices. Essentially, Canada replaced U.S. imports with higher-value exports, strengthening its own dairy sector while weakening the U.S. position. Economists point out that this isn't just smart trade, it's a power move. By standing firm, Canada sent a message: it controls its market, and foreign producers can't bully their way in. Global implications. This US-Canada dairy standoff isn't just a North American issue. Globally, dairy is a competitive and sometimes cutthroat industry. Countries like Australia, New Zealand, and members of the EU are watching closely. If US exporters lose Canada as a reliable market, they will seek other partners, and not all of them will offer favorable terms. Meanwhile, Canadian dairy companies are gaining credibility as a stable supplier willing to enforce rules and command premium prices. Other countries may follow suit, meaning the US could face similar barriers in the future if it doesn't adjust its trade policies. Economic ripple effect in America. The losses are felt far beyond the farm. Dairy processing plants, once operating near full capacity, have had to cut shifts or temporarily shut down lines. Milk trucks are being rerouted, refrigerated storage costs are skyrocketing, and local economies are starting to crumble. Rural towns dependent on dairy aren't just losing revenue, they're losing jobs, tax income, and community stability. Grocery chains that relied on steady supplies of American cheese and milk are scrambling to find alternatives, often at higher prices. Consumers may not see the immediate effect, but within months, dairy prices could spike at local stores. Experts warn that if the standoff continues, the U.S. dairy industry could permanently lose market share in North America, leaving farmers and rural communities to bear the brunt of economic pain. Political pressure and future strategies. Politically, U.S. lawmakers are under pressure. Some call for retaliatory tariffs on Canadian products, while others urge diplomacy to reopen trade channels. Meanwhile, industry groups are pushing for emergency aid packages to help farmers cope with the milk dumping crisis. The longer-term question remains: can the U.S. dairy sector adapt to these new realities? Options include diversifying export markets, investing in domestic value-added dairy products, and lobbying for fairer trade terms. But none of these solutions are quick fixes, and many farmers fear years of recovery ahead. Consumer impact. For U.S. consumers, the fallout is visible in grocery stores. Surplus cheese is being sold at discounted prices, but the supply is unpredictable. Smaller stores struggle to keep shelves stocked with consistent products, while national chains face logistical nightmares. Consumers who rely on consistent dairy prices may notice increases soon. Analysts predict that as the market corrects, milk, cheese, and butter could all become more expensive, hitting households that are already stretched financially. From the crisis. This crisis reveals a few hard truths. First, the U.S. dairy industry has underestimated Canada's resolve to protect its farmers. Second, relying too heavily on one neighboring market is risky, even when trade agreements exist. Finally, global trade is no longer about just producing cheap goods, it's about strategic positioning, enforcement, and negotiating power. Canada's billion-dollar deals show that strong trade policies can pay off. For the U.S., it's a wake-up call: losing one market can have cascading effects across an entire industry, from farm to factory to consumer. In less than 48 hours, the U.S. dairy industry went from confident exporters to victims of a sudden trade wall. Milk is being dumped, cheese is piling up, and rural economies are suffering. Meanwhile, Canada walked away with billions in new deals, proving that strategic enforcement pays off. For American farmers, the road ahead is uncertain. They must navigate lost revenue, political wrangling, and a global market that's moving faster than ever. One thing is clear: this isn't just about cheese. It's a lesson in trade, strategy, and resilience. If you want to stay updated on breaking trade news and economic stories that affect your wallet, make sure to subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you never miss a critical update.